So this is research on the issue of wage theft that we carried out, and I'll define that in a second, but focus on wage theft, time theft, and discrimination in San Diego County restaurant jobs. So this is research that we carried out together with San Diego State University Sociology Department. Let me define what I mean by wage theft. We were looking at wage theft, and by that we simply mean the illegal withholding of wages or denial of benefits that are rightfully owed to an employee. So, you know, if someone shows up for work, at the end of the day they don't get paid anything, that's wage theft. But if someone, some of the other examples, and we'll go into the various kinds of wage theft that we looked at, if someone shows up for work because their employer asked them to half an hour early to prepare things before the store opens, but they're not allowed to clock in until the store opens, and then they stay half an hour after the store closes, after they've already clocked out, to clean things up and get ready for the next day, that time that they're not getting paid for, that off-the-clock time, is also wage theft, because under state and federal law, they should be paid for the time that they're doing work for their employer. With a classroom full of graduate students, we were able to go out and interview, as you see here, 337 respondents and find the number of violations that we did. So in addition to these surveys, the students did 30 deeper open-ended interviews with restaurant workers, and they also did 40 visits where they were sort of surveying the restaurant and seeing the racial and ethnic breakdown of the folks in different types of positions at the restaurants. So what we found among those 337 food service industry employees that we surveyed, 77% reported that they had experienced some form of wage theft in the past year, and 33% said it happened regularly, which is to say they said it happened either always or often. So here's a number of different types of wage theft that we asked about. As I mentioned, one form is off-the-clock work. 60% had experienced that form of wage theft in the past year, where 15% said they experienced it always or often. Not paid for reporting time. So here's another type of violation. If you show up for work in the morning or in the afternoon, if you're a swing shift worker at night, anyway, when you show up for work, if your employer tells you, oh, sorry, there's no work today, right? You're out the cost of commuting, maybe you're out the cost of childcare for your children. You've invoked costs to get there and be available for work. So under state and federal law, your employer is required to make a minimum payment to you, which depending on your scheduled time is either 2 hours or a share of your scheduled time. So 35% of the workers that we interviewed said they had experienced that in the last year, where they'd shown up for work and not been paid what was owed in terms of what's called reporting time, and 6% experienced it regularly. Under California law, in addition to the 40-hour limit, if you work more than 8 hours in one day, the additional hours beyond 8 are also supposed to be paid as overtime under state law. So 30% of the folks that we surveyed had experienced working overtime, either more than 40 hours or more than 8 hours in a day, and not being paid the overtime that they were owed under the law. 11% experienced that regularly. If you work 7 days, regardless of whether you've exceeded 40 hours, on the 7th day, all those hours are supposed to be paid at time and a half. One of the other issues that we looked at was tip theft. So state law and federal law are very clear in terms of that tips belong to the workers who provide the service. They don't belong to the company, the restaurant owners, they don't belong to management. They're the property of the workers providing service. In California, there's one minimum wage, whether you receive tips or you don't, but not all employers follow that practice. So some employers illegally deduct or reduce the pay of the workers that we interviewed because of the tips that they received. As you may know, if you're in business or you know someone who's in business, if you're processing credit card charges, the company that does that processing for you takes a small percentage. But again, the law is clear that the tips belong to workers, and the law is also very clear that the employer can't take a percentage out for the fees that the credit card companies charges them, that they owe their employees the full amount of tips that you as the customer wrote down on your credit card slip to go to your server. So in terms of the kinds of wage theft that we looked at, we also looked at how the impacts differed among different parts of the workforce, different segments of the workforce. As you can see here, female workers are more likely to experience at least one of these forms of wage theft always or often. So this is folks that experience it regularly, which is to say they reported some form of wage theft always or often. So female workers more likely to experience it than males in our survey. Older workers over age 35 more likely to experience these forms of wage theft regularly than younger workers. Latinos more likely to experience them than white workers. Foreign-born workers more likely to experience them than US-born workers. And folks who work in the back of the house, in the kitchen, are more likely to experience these kinds of wage theft than folks who work in the front of the house out in the area that's in the view of customers. So one of the other requirements of state and federal law is around rest breaks, both rest and meal breaks. So as you may know, or as many workers unfortunately don't entirely realize, you're allowed a 10-minute rest break for each 4 hours that you work. 47% of workers surveyed reported that their employer rarely or never provided the conditions for them to take breaks. 67% of the workers we surveyed reported not getting legally required meal breaks. So if you work more than 5 hours, you get a half-hour unpaid meal break. So 67, and that's supposed to be, again, it's unpaid, but it's also supposed to be uninterrupted. It's not like that you take a couple of bites of your food and run back out and serve a customer. One of the other things that workers in the restaurant industry experience is being on call and having uncertainty in whether they were going to be called in to work. Typically the schedules are part-time, and so even if workers aren't explicitly required to be on call, they're usually fairly desperate to add hours to their schedule because they need the money. And so even if they're not in a formal sort of on-call relationship, they're often sitting by the phone hoping that they get called in for a shift. 37% experienced being on call. 14% said it happened regularly. I think the biggest policy recommendation that we have in general is making sure that there are the resources, that we're devoting the resources as a society to make sure that these laws are followed. I mean, we devote a lot of resources to enforce other laws. The amount of losses that working people experience based on these kind of violations is huge. I mean, it's millions of dollars in the state of California that we're letting people take out of the pockets of hardworking people that, like the stories that Lisa told, are just struggling to get by. From a practical matter, workers, you just can't rely on your employer and what they put on the timesheet. You need to, if you're concerned about any of this stuff, you need to make sure that you're tracking your hours separately and that you have your own record of the time that you worked, so that you can, if you want to bring any kind of action to try and get what's owed to you, it's really important that you have your own record.